The year is 1347. A single ship glides into the Sicilian port of Messina. Its crew is not dead, but dying. Their bodies a grotesque map of black swellings and fevered agony. A contagion has hitched a ride on the trade winds of a connected world. We watch as the horror unfolds not in silence, but to the deafening, discordant crash of collapsing markets. A merchant's ledger, its columns once bursting with profit, is now stained with a single, final entry: God's will. A field of golden wheat, ripe for harvest, stands untouched, swaying in a wind that carries only the scent of decay from a nearby village. A lord's treasury, overflowing with silver pennies from his serf's labor, sits useless, its coins unable to command the one thing it now desperately needs: hands to work, soldiers to fight, breath to breathe. This is the opening scene of the worst catastrophe in human history. But what if this story of utter devastation carries within it a twisted, overlooked secret? What if the very mechanism of Europe's collapse, the annihilation of its workforce, was also the brutal, unforgiving key that unlocked a revolution in human liberty and economic power? The Black Death did not merely kill people, it executed an economic system. For centuries, the manorial model had been the unchallenged engine of Europe. Lords owned the land, the law, and the lives of the peasantry bound to it as serfs. Their wealth was extracted not through innovation, but through the immutable mathematics of feudal obligation. A surplus of labor meant wages were kept at subsistence, and mobility was a fantasy. The peasant's world was one of geographic and economic stagnation, a cycle of toil where the fruits of his labor eternally filled another's granary. The system was rigid, top-heavy, and brutally efficient, so long as the population remained high. The plague shattered this calculus with the efficiency of a scythe. As the mortality rate climbed to 60% in some regions, the landscape of labor was transformed overnight. Villages stood empty, fields lay fallow, and workshops fell silent. The sheer scale of the depopulation created a seismic shift in the fundamental relationship between capital and labor. For the first time, labor became scarce. And in economics, scarcity equals power. The surviving lords, staring at unharvested crops and untilled fields, faced a simple, terrifying equation. Their land was worthless without someone to work it. Their titles and lineage meant nothing against the relentless logic of empty stomachs and rotting harvests. This new reality gave the surviving peasant a weapon they had never possessed: bargaining power. A lord desperate to save his estate could no longer command labor. He had to compete for it. The old fixed rents and obligatory workdays, the corvée, became impossible to enforce when a peasant could simply walk to the next manor, where a more desperate lord might offer better terms. This was the birth of a true labor market. Wages began to rise, not through benevolence, but through brutal necessity. The iron laws of supply and demand, suppressed for centuries by feudal custom, were violently unleashed. And so, from the ashes of a dead generation, a new economic actor began to stir. The surviving serf, now able to sell his labor to the highest bidder, found coins accumulating in a palm once calloused only for a master's gain. He could negotiate for cash payments instead of servile duties, buy his freedom, or lease land on favorable terms. This incremental accumulation of wealth and choice was the first, tremulous heartbeat of a new class. It was not born from a charter or a revolution, but from a pathogen that rewrote the continent's balance of power. The stage was now set for a prolonged, bitter struggle as the old order fought to reclaim its lost control, setting the scene for a century of social upheaval that would determine whether this flicker of economic agency would be extinguished or would ignite into a lasting flame. The Lord's Last Stand. The first image, a furious king, dressed in rich velvets, slams the ordinance of laborers' parchment onto a council table, his face a mask of regal outrage. The second, a gaunt peasant, now with a small pouch of coins at his belt, is confronted by a stern bailiff pointing to the same parchment nailed to a church door. The third, a lord surveys his depleted fields, his expression caught between aristocratic disdain and naked fear. How does a ruling class react when the very foundations of its wealth are crumbling? With legislation, coercion, and a desperate attempt to turn back time. The immediate reaction from the terrified aristocracy and crown was one of panicked suppression. The economic logic of higher wages was undeniable, but to the landed elite, it was an affront to the divine and social order. In England, King Edward III's response was the 1349 Ordinance of Labourers, swiftly followed by the 1351 Statute of Labourers. These were not mere suggestions. They were an economic counter-revolution enacted into law. The statutes mandated that all able-bodied men and women under 60, who did not own land or practice a craft, must work for any employer who demanded it, at pre-plague wage levels. Prices for goods and food were also frozen. The goal was simple: to use the power of the state to artificially recreate the labor surplus that the plague had destroyed, to force the genie of market wages back into the bottle. Enforcement was brutal and systemic. Local justices of the peace, drawn from the very landowning class that stood to benefit, were empowered to hunt down idle laborers and punish those who paid or received wages above the set rate. Fines, imprisonment, and public branding were the tools of this new economic policing. For a brief moment, it seemed the old world might reassert itself through sheer legal force. Manorial courts strained to enforce the old obligations, and bailiffs roamed the countryside, trying to tie the newly mobile peasants back to their ancestral plots under the old, exploitative terms. But the legislation ran headlong into a force more powerful than any royal decree: geographic reality. The law could be harsh in one village, but the next shire over might have been hit harder by the plague, making its lords even more desperate. A peasant fined for taking high wages in Kent could simply flee to Essex, where demand for his hands might be even greater. The statutes created a continent-wide game of cat and mouse, but the mice now had options. The unity of the feudal system was fractured by local disparities in mortality and lordly desperation. Furthermore, the laws failed to account for the psychological transformation in the surviving workforce. Having tasted the power of choice and the tangible reward of higher pay, peasants were no longer the docile, resigned population of 1346. They had seen the system break. They knew their labor had value because they had watched lords plead for it. This newfound consciousness bred resentment and resistance. The statutes became a symbol not of order, but of injustice, a blatant attempt by the rich to steal the one piece of good fortune the poor had wrested from the jaws of catastrophe. This simmering resentment, stoked by the blatant hypocrisy of elites trying to legislate against economic reality, would soon find its explosive outlet, pushing the social fabric of England toward a rupture that would echo through the ages. The golden chains of custom. First, a haunting scene. A widow in a threadbare dress weeps over a single silver coin in her palm, the wage for a day's work deemed illegal by a distant justice. Next, a determined craftsman packs his tools into a cart, his gaze fixed on the road leading away from his lord's manor. Finally, a small, independent farmer stands proudly before a modest but freehold plot of land, the deed clasped in his hand. The law said stay and starve, but a new, unspoken mantra was taking hold: move and thrive. For those with even a marginal skill, the post-plague world shimmered with possibility far beyond the reach of the blunt statute of laborers. This was the dawn of the masterless man, a carpenter, mason, or blacksmith whose services were in crippling demand could now become a true itinerant professional. He was no longer bound to serve the manor on which he was born. He could take his tools and his reputation from town to town, contracting his labor to the highest bidder. Guilds, which had once tightly controlled entry to protect their members from competition, now faced a crisis. They needed new members to survive, but admitting too many would dilute their power. This tension forced guilds to adapt, sometimes relaxing their rules and inadvertently creating more avenues for skilled laborers to advance. The most profound shift, however, occurred on the land itself. The manorial system relied on the direct exploitation of serf labor on the lord's domain, his personal farm. With workers dead or fleeing, this system became untenable. Lords faced a stark choice: let the domain land lie barren, or fundamentally change how it was managed. Thus began the great shift from direct management to leasehold. Lords found it more profitable and far less administratively painful to parcel out their domain lands to enterprising peasants, often their former serfs, for a fixed annual cash rent. This transition was revolutionary. For the peasant, a leasehold was a gamble, but one with immense upside. He was now a small-scale entrepreneur. If he worked harder, innovated with new crops or methods, and brought in a bumper harvest, the surplus beyond his rent was his. Profit, a concept formerly reserved for merchants and lords, entered the vocabulary of the common farmer. He began to think in terms of investment, yield, and market prices. The relationship was no longer one of service, but of contract. The golden chain of custom, which bound him to the land, was being replaced by the silver link of a rent payment, a transaction that implied a degree of legal personhood and economic independence previously unthinkable. This quiet revolution in land tenure created the first capital accumulators from the peasantry. A successful leaseholder could save his surplus, buy more livestock, improve his tools, and eventually, crucially, purchase his land outright, becoming a yeoman farmer. This class of small, independent landowners, emerging from the wreckage of the manors, would become the economic backbone and social stabilizer of early modern England. They were the prototype of the property-owning middle class, economically secure, socially ambitious, and fiercely protective of the rights their wealth afforded them. The plague had not just raised wages, it had begun to rewrite the very definition of property and prosperity. The Peasants' Revolt, a premature revolution. Image 1. A radical priest, John Ball, preaches to a hushed crowd of peasants under an ancient oak tree, his fingers stabbing the air as he delivers the incendiary line. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Image 2. A furious mob, armed with scythes and bows, burns court records in a manor house courtyard, the parchment scrolls curling into ash, a deliberate attack on the legal chains of serfdom. Image 3. The young King Richard II, a boy of 14, faces the rebel army at Smithfield, his regal composure a thin veneer over palpable terror. The economic pressure had built for a generation. In 1381, the lid blew off. The Peasants' Revolt was not a spontaneous outburst of hunger. It was a sophisticated, targeted political uprising fueled by the economic transformations and bitter resentments of the post-plague decades. The immediate trigger was the hated poll tax of 1380, a flat-rate tax that fell disproportionately on the poor. But the rebels' demands, articulated by leaders like Wat Tyler and the ideologue John Ball, reveal a deep understanding of their new economic position. They did not simply demand lower taxes. They demanded the total abolition of serfdom. We will be free forever. The end of feudal labor services and the right to rent land at a fair standardized price of 4 pence an acre. They were, in essence, demanding that the de facto economic reality of their bargaining power be recognized as de jure law. The revolt's brief, terrifying success demonstrated the newfound confidence and organization of the lower orders. Rebels marched on London, not as a rabble, but as a force with clear objectives: execute the traitors around the king, the chancellor and treasurer, destroy the legal records of their bondage, and force the king to grant their charters of freedom. For a few days in June 1381, they held the capital and the kingdom's fate in their hands. Their meeting with Richard II at Mile End produced royal charters promising everything they asked for. It was the apex of their power and the prelude to their betrayal. The revolt's brutal suppression, Wat Tyler's murder at Smithfield, the king's swift retraction of the charters, and the bloody reprisals that followed, is often told as a tale of failed revolution. In the short term, it was. The old order reasserted its violent authority. However, to view it solely as a failure is to miss its profound, long-term impact. The revolt was a seismic shock to the system. It demonstrated that the peasantry was no longer a passive, atomized mass, but a class capable of collective action with a coherent economic program. It put the ruling elite on explicit notice. The pre-plague world was gone, and attempts to restore it by force would meet with explosive, organized resistance. While the lords won the Battle of 1381, they ultimately lost the war to restore serfdom. The cost of suppression, both in blood and in the constant fear of another uprising, made the rigid enforcement of the old labor statutes increasingly impractical and dangerous. The revolt thus acted as a violent accelerant for the very economic changes it championed. It made the gradual shift to cash rents and wage labor not just an economic convenience, but a political necessity for social stability. The middle class was not born in the revolt's fires, but those fires cleared the political underbrush, ensuring its economic seedlings could no longer be easily stamped out. The inflationary spiral, silver and psychology. A close-up, dramatic still life, a heap of English silver pennies, newly minted, gleaming coldly. Next, a merchant's face, caught between greed and confusion, as he weighs a bag of these coins that now buys less grain than it did the year before. Finally, a peasant family at a market stall, their expressions turning from hope to dismay as they realize the price of a wool blanket has jumped again. The rise in wages was only half the story. A more insidious, complex force was now at play, a collision of money, perception, and human desire that would redefine the very meaning of wealth. With more coins in their purses, survivors of the plague did something profoundly human. They sought to improve their lives beyond mere subsistence. This was a revolution in demand. For centuries, peasant consumption had been brutally constrained. Diet was monotonous: bread, pottage, ale. Clothing was rough homespun. Luxuries were undreamed of. Now, with disposable income, they wanted better food, more meat, fish, and white bread. They wanted colorful dyes for their wool, better quality linen, and even small luxuries like metal cooking pots, knives, and pewter tableware. This surge in demand for manufactured and traded goods strained supply chains, still recovering from demographic collapse, pushing prices up. This phenomenon intersected with a critical monetary trend: the Great Bullion Famine. Europe's silver mines were depleted, and the flow of precious metals from trade was disrupted. Yet, here was the paradox. While the total stock of coinage may not have increased dramatically initially, its velocity, the speed at which it changed hands, exploded. Peasants were now active participants in the cash economy, not just its subjects. Money was moving from wage payer to wage earner to merchant and back again at an unprecedented rate. This rapid circulation created the perception of more money in the economy, further fueling price rises. The result was a corrosive inflationary spiral that bewildered contemporaries. A lord paying double the pre-plague wages for a laborer found that the rent he collected, often fixed by long-term lease, was now worth less in real terms. His static income was being eroded by rising costs. For the wage-earning peasant, the picture was mixed. In many cases, the rise in money wages outpaced the rise in the price of basic commodities for much of the late 14th century, leading to a genuine improvement in living standards, a fact confirmed by economic historians. They could buy more and better goods. But this very success bred social tension and a new economic anxiety. The traditional elite saw their fixed incomes shrinking in value, while upstart laborers flaunted better clothes and food. Moralists and poets like William Langland railed against the indignity of laborers who demanded king's coin and ate dainty food. Inflation became a cultural battleground, a sign of a world turned upside down. It taught all classes a harsh lesson in fluid economics. The nominal value of money was not the same as its real purchasing power. This financial education was another step away from a feudal world of static values and toward a modern, market-driven one of flux and calculation, where the middle-class accumulator had to learn not just to earn, but to strategically spend and save. The land rush and the rise of the yeoman. A wide, sweeping landscape painting. Where once there was a vast, open lord's domain, we now see a patchwork of smaller, neatly hedged fields, each under different, intensive cultivation. A focused portrait, a yeoman farmer, his face lined but confident, surveys his mixed farm. Sheep in one pasture, grain in another, a sturdy house of timber and stone in the background. A detailed still life, a table spread with a woolen tapestry, a silver spoon, and a bound book, possessions unthinkable for his grandfather. The scramble for land was creating a new aristocracy of dirt. As the demographic shockwave receded, a vast amount of land became available. Not just vacant peasant strips in the open fields, but entire hamlets, lost villages, abandoned to weeds. This presented an unprecedented opportunity for consolidation. The most successful peasants, those who had prospered from high wages or savvy leasing, began to buy up these parcels. They enclosed smaller plots, creating larger, more efficient, and privately managed farms. This land rush from below was a quiet, relentless process of accumulation that fundamentally changed the rural social structure. This is where the yeoman class solidified. A yeoman was typically a freeholder who owned his land outright or held it by a secure, non-feudal lease. His farm was large enough to produce a significant marketable surplus, but he still worked it himself with his family and perhaps a few hired hands. He was the quintessential capitalist farmer, responsive to prices, innovating with crops like legumes to improve soil, and often combining arable farming with sheep rearing to tap into the lucrative wool trade. His wealth was not extracted from others' labor, but built on the productivity of his own land and acumen. The economic independence of the yeoman translated into profound social and political confidence. He was the backbone of the English militia, the famed longbowman who had won at Crécy and Poitiers. He served on juries, as a parish constable, and in local government. He sent his sons to grammar schools and, in time, to the universities. The yeoman was a living repudiation of the feudal ideal that status was derived solely from noble blood and inherited title. Here was a man whose authority stemmed from acreage, sound management, and hard coin. This class became the crucial buffer in English society. They were not poor and restless like landless laborers, nor were they part of the often indebted and struggling lesser nobility. They were economically resilient, socially ambitious, and deeply invested in stability and the rule of law, as long as that law protected their property. The rise of the yeomanry ensured that the post-plague economic gains were not just a fleeting windfall for wage laborers, but were cemented into the landscape itself through permanent, heritable property ownership. They were the solid, agrarian foundation upon which a broader commercial middle class would later be built. Consumption and the birth of a material culture. A bustling market square scene. Stalls are piled not just with basic foodstuffs, but with Flemish cloth, leather goods, pewterware, and even a few books. A peasant woman, her dress of a finer cut and color than her mother's would have been, carefully selects a decorated ceramic jug. A craftsman's workshop. The interior is well lit, tools are hung neatly, and the artisan himself wears a shirt of good linen. The accumulation of wealth was meaningless without an outlet. That outlet was consumption, and it was reshaping culture from the ground up. The post-plague period witnessed a consumer revolution centuries before the one historians associate with the 18th century. Archaeological evidence from medieval peasant homes tells a startling story, a dramatic increase in the variety and quality of material goods. Where homes once yielded only coarse pottery, bone tools, and little else, we now find imports like German stoneware, better quality metal implements, window glass, and remains of more varied diets including fish and meat. This wasn't just about utility, it was about comfort, display, and identity. Fashion, once the exclusive domain of the elite, began to trickle down. Sumptuary laws passed in the late 14th century, which tried to regulate what different classes could wear, are themselves proof of a panic. Legislators were aghast that grooms and serving girls were dressing in silks and furs that mimicked their betters. The attempt to control dress through law was a doomed effort to shore up visual social hierarchies that economic change was blurring. For the new middle ranks, clothing became a powerful semaphore, a way to visually announce their hard-won prosperity and social arrival. This rise in domestic comfort and personal adornment had a multiplier effect on the economy. It stimulated craft production, retail trade, and regional specialization. The demand for better cloth boosted the wool, weaving, and dyeing industries. The desire for pewter tableware encouraged tin, mining, and metalworking. A more complex economy, less focused on sheer subsistence, began to emerge. It created jobs not just in primary production, but in finishing, transporting, and selling goods. This material awakening fostered a new mentality, a sense of individual and familial improvement tied to tangible possessions. The home became a site of investment and pride, not just a shelter. Planning for the future could now include budgeting for a better roof, a new piece of furniture, or a dowry of actual value for a daughter. This shift from a survival mindset to an accumulation and consumption mindset is a cornerstone of middle-class identity. The plague, by creating the necessary surplus in commoners' hands, had inadvertently launched the engine of consumer demand that would drive economic modernization for centuries to come. The gentry gambit, when the elite joined the revolution. A symbolic painting, a knight doffs his rusting chainmail and places it in a chest, then picks up a ledger and a quill. A scene of calculated alliance. A gentry landowner shares a meal with a wealthy wool merchant, their discussion intense over a map of enclosed pastures. A portrait of new power. A Tudor-era gentleman, dressed in fine but sober cloth, stands before his country house, a testament to commercial, not martial, success. The most profound testament to the new economic order was not the peasants' rise, but the lord's adaptation. The lesser nobility, the knights and esquires who would coalesce into the gentry, faced the toughest squeeze after the plague. They lacked the vast, diversified estates of the great magnates, yet they were expected to maintain a costly martial lifestyle. Many were crippled by fixed rents and rising labor costs. Their choice was stark: cling to a dying feudal ethos and face economic ruin, or embrace the new commercial realities. A significant portion chose the latter, becoming the most dynamic capitalist agents of the age. These gentry landowners became aggressive agricultural improvers. They were at the forefront of the enclosure movement, converting arable land to more profitable sheep pastures for the wool trade. They rationalized their estates, evicting smallholders to create larger, more efficient farms they could lease at competitive market rates. They invested in mining, milling, and even early industrial ventures. Crucially, they often married into wealthy merchant families from the towns, merging landed prestige with commercial acumen and fresh capital. This gentry gambit had two seismic consequences. First, it legitimized the profit motive and commercial activity for the upper echelons of society. When a knight became a careful estate manager and wool exporter, the stigma around trade and money grubbing began to erode. Economic savvy became a respected, even necessary, attribute for status preservation. Second, it created a powerful political alliance. The interests of the commercially minded gentry and the rising urban merchant class began to align. Both wanted stable property rights, predictable laws conducive to business, and a crown that didn't arbitrarily tax or disrupt commerce. This alliance would become the political engine of the Tudor and Stuart periods, culminating in conflicts like the English Civil War. Parliament, increasingly dominated by gentry and burghers, the urban middle class, became the forum for defending this new, property-based order against royal attempts at arbitrary taxation. Thus, the economic revolution sparked by the plague didn't just create a middle class. It eventually transformed a section of the old ruling class into its most powerful wing, ensuring that the new economic principles would be encoded into the nation's laws and governance. The elite hadn't been overthrown. It had been co-opted, securing the future of the system it once fought. Urban ascendancy, the town's triumphant hour. A dynamic city gate scene. Carts laden with grain and wool roll in, while well-dressed craftsmen and traders move purposefully through the crowded streets. Inside a guild hall, masters and prosperous merchants debate policies, their fine clothing and serious demeanor a world away from peasant assemblies. A merchant's counting house. He reviews bills of lading for goods from Italy and Flanders, his world connected by credit and commerce, not soil. If the countryside birthed the middle class, the towns and cities were where it came of age. Towns, initially devastated by the plague, recovered with explosive vitality. Their economies, based on trade and skilled craftsmanship, were perfectly positioned to benefit from the new dynamics. The surge in rural demand for manufactured goods flooded towns with orders and cash. The labor shortage here was even more acute for skilled positions, driving up artisans' wages spectacularly. A master mason or weaver could achieve a level of wealth and comfort that made him the undeniable equal of a minor country gentleman. Urban guilds, after an initial period of crisis, adapted to harness this boom. They regulated quality, protecting their brand, trained apprentices, rebuilding their ranks, and controlled local markets. For a successful master, guild membership was a path to civic power. He could become a councilman, an alderman, even a mayor. Urban government became a vehicle for middle-class interests, protecting trade routes, maintaining standards, and building the infrastructure of commerce. The greatest beneficiaries were the merchants, the true architects of a pan-European middle class. They operated in a world of credit, partnerships, and long-distance trade that was inherently modern. The post-plague demand for luxuries and better quality goods fueled trade with the Low Countries, Italy, and the Baltic. Merchants amassed fortunes that dwarfed those of all but the greatest nobles. This mercantile wealth was fluid, mobile, and reinvestable. It funded exploration, banking, and early industry. The town became a social and cultural melting pot where the lines between wealthy merchant, successful lawyer, educated professional, and prosperous artisan blurred. They intermarried, lived in similar fine houses, and shared a common worldview centered on enterprise, literacy, and legal rights. The bourgeois values of thrift, calculation, and investment for future gain were crystallized here. The independent, commercially minded urban citizen, free from direct feudal ties, became the ultimate expression of the middle-class ideal. The city was not just a place of business. It was the incubator for a new societal mindset that would shape the modern world. The uninherited legacy, a world remade. A final, contemplative triptych. Panel 1, a humble 14th century peasant grave marker. Panel 2, a vibrant 16th century painting of a merchant's family, confident and richly dressed. Panel 3, a modern, abstract representation of global economic networks and a thriving consumer society. The thread connecting them is not a royal lineage, but an unbroken chain of economic cause and effect. The story that began in disease and despair ends in a legacy that defines our world. The Black Death did not invent the middle class in a single stroke. Such a complex social formation is never born from a single event, but it acted as the ultimate historical catalyst, applying a pressure so extreme and sudden that it shattered the immutable constraints of feudalism. By annihilating the population, it transformed labor from a cheap commodity into a valued asset. This simple, brutal shift in scarcity unleashed a cascade of consequences. Rising wages, a competitive land market, the shift to rents, peasant mobility, and the accumulation of capital from below. This economic empowerment, fought over in revolts and grudgingly accepted by adapting elites, laid the material foundation. It created the yeoman farmer, the independent artisan, and the wealthy merchant. It stimulated a consumer revolution that diversified the economy. It forced a merger between commercial wealth and social aspiration, giving rise to a class defined not by birth but by property, profession, and purchased comfort. The psychological shift was as critical as the economic one, a move from a mindset of custom and obligation to one of contract, calculation, and individual agency. The Black Death dividend was therefore the creation of the preconditions for modern capitalism and the liberal social order. It weakened the power of inherited status and strengthened the power of earned wealth. It made social mobility a tangible, if difficult, possibility. It established the idea that economic value is determined by the market forces of supply and demand, not by feudal decree. The world that emerged from the plague's shadow was more fluid, more anxious, more innovative, and far more centered on the individual economic actor than the one that had preceded it. We live in the long aftermath of that 14th century catastrophe. The very concept of a self-made person, the dynamics of a labor market, the centrality of consumer demand, and the social power of the professional and commercial classes all find a pivotal point of origin in the terrible, transformative years when a plague, by dismantling one world, inadvertently midwifed the birth of our own. The middle class was its most enduring and perhaps most unexpected creation. The story of the Black Death is often one of unrelenting tragedy. But history, like economics, thrives on paradox. From the heart of collapse came the seeds of renewal. From the grim accounting of death emerged a new calculus of life, liberty, and pursuit of prosperity. The path was neither straight nor fair, but it was decisive. It reminds us that the foundations of our modern world, the very idea of economic opportunity and social mobility, were forged in the most unforgiving of fires. What other hidden dividends lie buried within history's greatest disasters? The search for those answers is what keeps the story of our past and our present forever compelling.